https://u2.be//shuex5qw_psi/3kscjwkvn_klv 2x. The silence didn't break quietly. It shattered. For years, fans argued, theorized, and replayed old footage trying to understand why certain moments were never addressed, why explosive tension was met with tight smiles and clipped answers, why Tamar Braxton, the loudest voice in the room, suddenly learned how to go quiet. And now, with one carefully timed revelation, Tamar and ASHLEE Braxton have blown the lid off a truth that's been suffocating under the surface for far too long. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't maturity. This was survival. It started with a single sentence that sent shockwaves through social media like an earthquake no one saw coming. We didn't stay silent, because we were at peace. That line alone triggered a frenzy. Old clips resurfaced. Reunion episodes were dissected frame by frame. Fans noticed the pauses, the forced laughs, the moments where words were swallowed instead of spoken. And then came the name everyone knew would eventually surface, Evelyn, finally addressed, not with screaming accusations, but with a calm so deliberate it felt dangerous. Insiders immediately whispered that this moment was years in the making. Those conversations happened off camera. Those warnings were issued without being written down. That power doesn't always need contracts or threats to be effective. Sometimes it just needs influence, access, and timing. Tamar didn't come out swinging. That's what scares people. Because when someone stops yelling and starts explaining, it means the story has evolved past drama and into something far more unsettling. Within hours, Twitter turned into a war zone. TikTok went into full investigation mode. Fans began asking the question no one wanted to say out loud: who benefited from the silence, and what did it cost to keep it? Because if two sisters known for speaking their minds chose restraint for years, then whatever was happening behind the scenes wasn't just messy. It was powerful. And as the silence finally cracks, one thing is clear: this isn't a confession. It's a reckoning. The truth didn't arrive as a scream. It arrived as a controlled exhale, the kind that tells you someone has been holding their breath for years and finally decided they were done suffocating. Tamar Braxton didn't storm the internet with accusations. She didn't throw chairs, or flip tables, or drop a rage-filled rant. Instead, she sat still, looked straight into the camera, and said something that made longtime fans feel physically uneasy. There were things we were told not to talk about. And there were consequences attached. That single line cracked open a decade of unanswered questions, and suddenly the silence everyone mocked started to look less like avoidance, and more like a warning sign no one wanted to read. ASHLEE Braxton followed, and her voice didn't shake, which somehow made it worse. She spoke about meetings that happened off camera, about conversations that never made it to air, about moments when she was told, very calmly, that pushing back would only make things harder. Not louder. Not messier. Just harder. She described watching narratives form in real time, watching editors shape stories without context, watching social media decide who was guilty before the people involved were even allowed to speak. And the most chilling part wasn't what she said, it was what she implied. That silence wasn't a personal choice. It was a condition. That's when fans started rewatching everything with new eyes. Reunion episodes where Tamar paused mid-sentence. Confessionals where ASHLEE looked like she wanted to say more but didn't. Moments where tension spiked and then suddenly vanished without explanation. Clips that once felt awkward now felt strategic. People noticed how certain confrontations were left unresolved. How one side always seemed to have the final word while the other smiled through clenched teeth. And then, inevitably, the name Evelyn started trending again, not as a fresh accusation, but as a reopened file everyone suddenly wanted to reread. What Tamar and ASHLEE made clear, without ever spelling it out directly, was that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's a phone call reminding you who controls the narrative. Sometimes it's a suggestion framed as advice. Now might not be the best time. Tamar admitted there were moments she wanted to explode publicly, moments where every instinct told her to defend herself. But she was reminded of contracts, of future opportunities, of how quickly the industry labels women as difficult once they stop playing along. And once that label sticks, it doesn't wash off easily. ASHLEE went even deeper, describing the isolation that comes with enforced quiet. Watching the internet fill in gaps with assumptions. Seeing fans turn disappointment into judgment. Being told that responding would only feed the drama, while knowing that staying silent allowed one version of events to harden into truth. She said the hardest part wasn't biting her tongue. It was watching people believe she had nothing to say. That her quiet meant agreement. That interpretation, she admitted, hurt more than any argument ever could. Social media reacted like gasoline hitting a spark. Some fans immediately rallied behind the sisters, saying this finally explained why so much of the story never added up. Others pushed back, accusing them of rewriting history or waiting too long. But even the skeptics couldn't ignore how measured the revelations were. There were no wild claims, no screaming matches, no receipts slammed on the table. Just context. And context, when it arrives late, has a way of unsettling people who were comfortable with simpler explanations. Then came the leaked whispers. Anonymous posts claiming there were group chats producers didn't want shown. Alleged messages advising cast members to let things cool down, rather than clarify. A rumored phone call where someone allegedly warned that speaking out would change how the network sees you. None of it confirmed, none of it denied, but enough to make people wonder how much pressure exists in spaces where cameras are always rolling and contracts are always looming. The most explosive moment came when Tamar addressed why now. She didn't frame it as revenge or closure. She framed it as timing. She said there comes a point where silence stops protecting you and starts erasing you. Where waiting no longer feels strategic, just heavy. She admitted she's in a different place now, with more control over her platform, and less incentive to protect relationships that demanded her quiet at the expense of her voice. That admission alone sent fans spiraling, because it suggested the silence wasn't about peace, it was about leverage. As the conversation spread, other celebrities started reacting in subtle ways. Liked posts. Cryptic captions. Comments disabled. A few reality stars hinted that Tamar and ASHLEE weren't alone, that enforced silence is an open secret no one wants to name, because naming it makes you a problem. One even posted, "Silence doesn't mean nothing happened. It means someone had more to lose." That quote went viral within minutes. But the tension didn't peak there. Because just as people started processing the idea that silence can be imposed without paperwork, Tamar dropped one more line, almost casually, that flipped the entire narrative on its head. She said, "There are things we still haven't said. Not because we can't. Because we're deciding how much the world is ready for." That sentence landed like a loaded gun on the table. Fans froze. Comment sections exploded. What else was there? What hasn't been shared yet? And more importantly, who would be exposed if it ever was? The internet leaned forward collectively, realizing this wasn't the end of the story. It was the opening crack. And whatever had been held back all these years was still sitting in the shadows, waiting for the next breath, the next shift in power, the next moment when silence would finally cost more than speaking. Once that sentence hit the air, the entire tone of the conversation shifted from reflective to dangerous. Because now it wasn't just about explaining the past. It was about what was still being protected in the present. Fans immediately noticed how Tamar's posture changed when she said it. Her shoulders stiffened. Her eyes dropped for a split second. That wasn't theatrics. That was calculation. The kind you make when you know the next truth could blow back on people who still hold power. ASHLEE didn't interrupt. She didn't nod. She just let the silence stretch, and that silence said more than any rant ever could. Then she added something that made the room feel smaller. She said that when you're inside these environments, silence becomes currency. You trade it for stability. You trade it for access. You trade it to avoid being frozen out quietly, professionally, permanently. She described how people assume NDAs are the only muzzles, but in reality, it's the fear of being labeled uncooperative that keeps mouths shut. Once that label appears in the wrong email chain, doors don't slam. They just stop opening. That's when the insider chatter got louder. Accounts that rarely post suddenly became active. Former assistants, stylists, production-adjacent people hinting that there were moments during filming where conversations were stopped mid-sentence. Those cast members were pulled aside and reminded of what the show needed. Certain confrontations were encouraged while others were quietly discouraged. No one named names. They didn't have to. The pattern was familiar to anyone who's ever watched reality TV long enough to notice who always gets the last word. Evelyn's name re-entered the conversation not as an accusation, but as a gravitational force. Fans weren't saying she orchestrated anything directly. They were saying the system seemed to bend in her favor. That she always appeared more insulated, more protected, more certain that her version of events would be the one preserved. Clips resurfaced where she spoke freely while others hesitated. Where she confronted without consequence while others were criticized for reacting. The question shifted from what happened to who had room to speak. Tamar addressed that without ever pointing a finger. She said power doesn't require bad intentions to create harm. Sometimes it's just proximity. Who produces trust? Who networks feel safe with? Who they believe audiences already understand. Once that trust exists, everything else tilts. ASHLEE added that when you're on the other side of that tilt, even defending yourself can be framed as aggression. Silence becomes the safer narrative, even when it costs you personally. Social media went into overdrive. Twitter threads broke down episode timelines. TikTok creators stitched old clips with new audio from Tamar and ASHLEE, highlighting moments where reactions suddenly made sense. One viral video paused on Tamar mid-reunion, eyes glistening, before cutting to her recent interview. The caption read, "This wasn't confusion. This was restraint." Millions agreed. Millions disagreed. But no one could unsee it. Then came the alleged leaks. Screenshots of supposed group messages where someone warned, "Let's not escalate this." Another where a cast member allegedly asked to address a rumor, and was advised to save it for later, a later that never came. Again, nothing confirmed, nothing denied, but enough smoke to make people wonder how often silence is curated behind the scenes while chaos is sold on screen. ASHLEE spoke about the emotional toll of that kind of restraint. She said it's not noble. It's exhausting. You carry versions of events in your body while the public carries a different story entirely. You start questioning your own memory, because the world seems so certain. She admitted there were nights she wanted to post, to clarify, to scream into the void, but she was reminded of how quickly backlash turns into blacklisting. How easily a moment of honesty can become a permanent reputation. That's when another celebrity quietly entered the chat. A former reality star, no longer under contract, posted a cryptic message. "If you all knew how many stories never get told because someone had more to lose than the truth, you'd watch these shows differently." The post was deleted within an hour. Screenshots lived forever. Fans read it as confirmation, without needing specifics. Tamar then revealed something that shifted the narrative again. She said silence didn't just protect careers. It protected mental health in the moment. When everything around you is loud, sometimes staying quiet is the only way to survive without breaking. She acknowledged that people saw her as strong, outspoken, unfiltered, but even she had limits. Even she could be cornered into choosing restraint over combustion. That admission stunned fans, who built their image of Tamar around fearless expression. The backlash came swiftly. Critics accused the sisters of soft-launching allegations without receipts, of stirring drama under the guise of healing. Tamar responded calmly, saying not every truth comes with screenshots, and not every experience needs a villain to be valid. She emphasized they weren't asking to be believed blindly. They were asking for the possibility that silence can be coerced by circumstance. Then ASHLEE dropped another quiet bomb. She said there were moments when speaking would have meant standing alone. When allies disappeared the moment tension rose. When support evaporated once cameras stopped rolling. She described realizing that some people cheer for your voice only when it entertains them, not when it complicates their comfort. That realization, she said, changed how she measured loyalty. The internet fractured into camps. One side demanded full disclosure now. The other argued that forcing survivors of pressure to perform their trauma publicly defeats the point. Hashtags battled. Think pieces multiplied. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to unpacking the idea of enforced silence. And through it all, Evelyn remained publicly calm, posting nothing directly related, which only fueled speculation further. The tension reached a boiling point when Tamar hinted, very carefully, that there were conversations she remembered differently than how they were portrayed. That edits can transform context into intent. That what looks like avoidance on screen may have been compliance off screen. She stopped herself before elaborating, smiled tightly, and said, "Some things make sense only when you've lived them." That restraint, again, spoke volumes. As the dust settled, one thing became clear. This wasn't about reopening old drama for entertainment. It was about reframing silence itself. About asking whether quiet moments deserve interrogation instead of assumption. About recognizing that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits, knowing others will speak less. And just when it seemed like the conversation might plateau, ASHLEE leaned forward and said something that made the room go still. She said, "There's a difference between choosing silence and being guided into it. And once you understand that difference, you start seeing everything differently." She paused, letting the weight land. Then she added, "And there are people who know exactly what I mean." That last line sent a chill through the timeline. Because it suggested witnesses. Shared understanding. A collective memory that hasn't been voiced yet. And in that moment, everyone realized this story wasn't winding down. It was tightening. And whatever came next wouldn't just explain the past. It would challenge how viewers interpret every quiet moment they've ever dismissed as nothing. By the time those words finished echoing, the conversation had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. Because now it wasn't just about Tamar and ASHLEE. It was about everyone who had ever benefited from the quiet, everyone who had watched the silence and decided not to question it. Fans started re-watching old episodes with a different lens, catching micro-expressions, awkward pauses, moments where conversations abruptly shifted. Scenes that once felt like filler suddenly looked like containment. People began asking why certain confrontations were allowed to explode while others were cut short, redirected, or buried under. The timeline turned forensic. Tweets broke down episode order against real-world events. Clips were slowed down, zoomed in, subtitled, dissected. One viral thread pointed out how often Tamar's reactions were narrated by others instead of explained by her. Another highlighted how ASHLEE was present for major moments, but rarely given space to speak directly. The pattern wasn't obvious at first glance, but once noticed, it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't about one argument. It was about whose voice was treated as authoritative, and whose was treated as reactive. Behind the scenes, more whispers surfaced. Not accusations, not exposés, just people saying, "This feels familiar." Former cast members from entirely different shows chimed in without naming names, describing the same unspoken rules. Don't rock the boat too hard. Don't challenge the narrative mid-season. Don't make producers choose between you and someone they already trust. The message was always polite, always indirect, and always clear. Play your role, or risk losing your seat at the table. Tamar addressed that head-on. She said there's a moment when you realize the table isn't neutral. It's owned. And once you see that, every choice changes. Speaking becomes less about truth and more about consequences. She admitted there were times she rehearsed what she wanted to say, only to hear her own voice and think, "This won't land the way I need it to. This will be edited. This will be framed. This will become something else." And so she swallowed it. Not because it wasn't true, but because it wasn't safe. ASHLEE added that silence doesn't freeze time. It stretches it. Years pass, and the version of events everyone accepted hardens. By the time you're ready to speak, people ask why now, instead of why not then. Timing becomes the weapon used against you. She said that's why breaking silence feels like reopening wounds, even when those wounds never healed. You're not reliving the moment. You're confronting the story that replaced it. Then came the moment that shifted everything again. Tamar said, very carefully, that there were people who benefited from her silence without ever asking for it. That quiet created space for other narratives to thrive. She didn't say exploitation. She didn't say manipulation. She said benefit. And that distinction mattered. Because it suggested intent wasn't required for imbalance to cause harm. Sometimes all it takes is being comfortable while someone else stays quiet. Social media split harder than before. Some demanded Evelyn respond directly. Others argued that forcing a response missed the point entirely. The story wasn't about a single person's reaction. It was about an ecosystem that rewards volume over vulnerability. Evelyn eventually posted a short, measured statement about growth, perspective, and respecting different experiences. It neither confirmed nor denied anything. And that neutrality poured gasoline on the fire. Fans read between every line. Why so calm? Why now? Why not address specifics? Others defended the response, saying not every situation requires public dissection. The comments turned into battlegrounds. Lives were launched. Spaces filled. Everyone wanted resolution, but no one could agree on what resolution even looked like. Tamar, watching the chaos unfold, made one last clarification. She said she wasn't asking for apologies. She wasn't asking for sides. She was asking for understanding. For the idea that silence can be strategic without being deceptive. That restraint can be survival, not surrender. She said the hardest part wasn't staying quiet. It was being misunderstood while doing it. ASHLEE closed with something that lingered long after the interview ended. She said there are conversations that only make sense when everyone involved feels equally safe to speak. Until then, fragments are all you get. Hints. Tone. Timing. And sometimes, silence is the loudest clue that something wasn't balanced. The internet didn't calm down after that. It got quieter in a different way. more reflective, more uneasy. Because people started realizing how many stories they've consumed where silence was treated as absence instead of evidence. How many times they filled in gaps without questioning who created them. And just as the conversation seemed to reach a fragile pause, Tamar posted a single line on her story. No context. No names. Just one sentence. Some truths wait, because they have to. That was it. No follow-up. No explanation. No clarification. And that's what made it terrifying. Because it suggested this wasn't the full story. That what had been shared so far was only the part that could be spoken safely. That there were layers still untouched, details still unvoiced, moments still protected by timing rather than fear. Now the question isn't whether Tamar and ASHLEE stayed silent. It's what that silence has been guarding all this time. And whether the next phase will bring understanding, or finally force the kind of conversations that were postponed for years for a reason no one wants to admit out loud. If you've made it this far, then you already know this isn't just another piece of celebrity gossip. This is one of those moments where the story keeps unfolding with or without you, and missing the next chapter means missing the truth as it happens in real time. The silence has cracked, the timeline is shifting, and every single move from here on out matters. This conversation isn't done. It's not settled. And it's definitely not finished telling the full story. More reactions are coming. More receipts may surface. More people who benefited from the quiet are watching the internet very closely right now. And trust this, when stories like this resurface after years of restraint, it's never accidental. It's timing. It's leverage. It's intention. So if you want to stay ahead of the narrative instead of catching up late, this is your moment. Hit that like button so this conversation doesn't get buried. Drop a comment with what you think the silence was really protecting, because the comment section is where patterns get noticed first. And if you're not subscribed, you're choosing to miss the fallout when it happens, not weeks later, not watered down, but as it breaks. Turn on notifications. Stay locked in. Because once people start breaking years of silence, they don't suddenly stop. And the next thing revealed could change how you see everything that came before. Don't scroll away now. This story is still breathing.